Hello and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by CMeister, hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about consumables, meals really specifically. CMeister begins, I've been thinking about consumables in various games. Monster Hunter has you consuming meals and buffs almost every fight, and while you might not be at risk of running out, you still need to farm or craft certain items. Monster Hunter's consumables are pretty intuitive, and I wouldn't say you need a guide. But take Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom. The potency your meal has depends on a few factors, such as the quality of the ingredients and the amount you throw into the cooking pot, and unfortunately, you cannot stack multiple food buffs or like elixirs at the same time. For example, eating a strength meal and then eating a cold resistant meal will cancel out your first meal, even though they give different types of buffs. There are extensive guides and videos out there that cover optimal food buffs and ingredients, so if you don't want to go crazy cooking through trial and error, I highly recommend looking at a guide. That's certainly relevant in a way it isn't for Monster Hunter, right? And for my final example, Remnant 2's consumables are more of an at your leisure part of the game. Most of the concoctions you buy last an hour and only one can be active at a time. No cooking, you just buy a potion, only one active at a time, you drink it, it lasts an hour. And some of the smaller consumables, like Confidence Booster, literally just some whiskey, only last 20 seconds. With these examples in mind, I guess I want to hear your opinions on why or why not you think these various consumable systems fit well into their respective games. If you have other examples, I'd happy to hear them too. Great. Yep. Cool. So first of all, the consumables here, I take it that you are focused on like medium term, limited resource buff things. I'm going to call them meals for the sake of this parlay. And I will use consumable more broadly to mean those and things like arrows and bombs in Legend of Zelda, or shock traps and trank bombs in Monster Hunter Wilds, null berries that remove elemental status effects. In Remnant 2, I'll also include in consumables things like the random grenades you get, and you get these items that like cure a blight on you. You get nettle blight or whatever it's called, and you can cure that. And meal here will specifically refer to this like medium term, you generally consume like an hour-ish long buff food. I actually have no idea how long they are in Breath of the Wild, so let's just take a gander. Oh, it looks like you can make them pretty long. Okay. Anyway, those meals specifically interesting. Yeah, because Monster Hunter Wilds and Tears of the Kingdom Breath of the Wild are pretty outlier examples. That's my take anyway. And the normal thing is that games have none of this type of thing, or they do what Remnant 2 was. It's like a really light offering in the game. It's pretty weird for it to be as involved of a mechanic in Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, and it's even weirder for it to be basically mandatory in Monster Hunter Wilds, or the gameplay loop intends you to do it every single time. For people who haven't played this game, in Monster Hunter Wilds and in previous Monster Hunters, some of your base stats come from your food. Your health bar literally won't fill all the way unless you have eaten a meal. You are meant to eat a meal before quite literally every single game action that you do, unless the buff hasn't run out yet. And it's not really intended to be a like optional buff that you can use the way the game frames it. We'll get back later to some players might use it that way, though. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying the game depicts it as if it's presented as if you don't even have your whole health bar until you do this. They could always have it be that your health bar is full and then it expands by a section when you eat the meal, but they choose to frame it as your full health bar is not filled all the way, chopped short, and they show you that it could be full unless you eat. So I would argue that way of framing it is whatever the player thinks, the game presents it as this is like your normal baseline health is gotten by eating a meal. Therefore, the basic thing you do is to go eat a meal. Pretty weird examples, whereas Remnant 2 here is very useful, kind of a good control, in my opinion. Let's get into a bit of a thesis for this parlay. Yes, I've come to really enjoy these meal systems as a mechanic personally, and the reasons are that one, it's like a mini optional build system. It's like a mini additional optional build system, basically. You can combine ingredients or effects in certain ways, choose the one effect that you're going to take with you, like an extra slot in your build, and you only get one. And that can be fun. It can add this kind of additional layer of customization to the game. You said in your question, prompt CMeister, that unfortunately you can't stack multiple food buffs and elixirs at the same time. Now, while that has various consequences for the game, for the appeal as a build system, that's not unfortunate at all, in my opinion. It means that there is a choice to be made. It isn't beneficial to cook a ton of different meals and eat them all, which would be probably somewhat tedious to do, because you can't have all the buffs at once. You can only have one buff anyway. So choose wisely, you make a meaningful choice, you go to the cold area and you feel the loss of that, attack buff, or I don't know what's in Breath of the Wild, health regen or whatever. That sounds pretty broken in Legend of Zelda, but maybe they have that. And that's meant to be the purpose of the system. I think that is not bad. I get why you would say, like, oh, you can't stack multiple. It would be nice to have a variety more buffs. And it could be interesting if the game gave you, a lot of games will do this, kind of one buff in each category, one type of offensive benefit, one type of defensive benefit. But depending on the game, sometimes there just isn't enough variety in there. And so to create interesting, meaningful decisions, opportunity cost, you need it to be that the player can have only one buff. And Monster Hunter does a similar thing. It will be that you eat, your offense buff, your defense buffer, a little less defense, but elemental resist. And then you can choose to expand it with an additional ingredient, maybe a finishing ingredient, and build out a meal like that. You get a little build. You can even save little combinations of meals as little builds for your food buff before you leave for the hunt. It's like a second build screen, basically. And the idea that it's optional means that the game has the ability to modulate. You can bring a kind of basic build. You don't think something is going to be that hard. And maybe it can be a way that you just kind of go out on your own. We'll talk about that more with Breath of the Wild later. I don't think that makes that much sense in Monster Hunter, but I'm sure it's something some people do. So that's one thing I like about these food making systems. For us to evaluate whether they're good, we need to discuss what could be the benefit of them. For some players, probably just see them as a tedious chore, much like making a build. Indeed, I think that is the double-edged sword here. You're asking the player for even more of their own customization and input, when for a lot of people, asking them to make a build is already asking too much, or they don't really want to go all the way into that right now. Breath of the Wild Tears of the Kingdom, you could argue, maybe doesn't ask you for a build in the same way, but Monster Hunter certainly does. And then having the player pick a food, well, it's easy to see why that's a more streamlined process than in Breath of the Wild. So you could also say that meals here are a way to kind of move around the build faffing. If you want the game to be more, you can just kind of go and explore the world, but sometimes you want to gear up. Maybe Breath of the Wild could be argued to have moved some of the build system into food a little bit, some of that build appeal, even though it's kind of light on that in general. Monster Hunter Wilds, on the other hand, is a game that wants you to make a build. That is a central feature of the game to an extent, a type of making a build anyway. And so because you kind of have to do that always anyway, the meal system is a little bit lighter. It's not as involved to make your food. But definitely still a core involved part of the game, I would argue anyway. You can probably see where I'm going with this. By contrast, Remnant 2 doesn't really do any of that design stuff. But that is a thing that I like about meal systems in general in games. They can be like an extra little build thing. And we'll get more into this theme as we go. They kind of allow the player to create a narrative of what they're saying they're doing. When you eat a meal that gives you better combat buffs, the player is saying, I'm ready for a fight. And that does something to the way the game is framed. It changes how you interact with the game or relate to the game when the game asks you to declare what you expect from the game. That has a significant psychological effect. So I think that's interesting. That's a big benefit. And then the second thing, I think, is that it gets people into their inventories. It creates variance, I guess, is what this point is, which I think could be good. Breath of the Wild has the controversial design decision to have weapons be destructible. You get a weapon and it has only so much durability before it's destroyed. I don't know about in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. There's certainly a way to repair weapons or things you've crafted. I don't know, but the game presents them as consumable. And here again, I'm summarizing consumables as just things the game presents as limited. It's okay if there is a way around it. We'll get into that with Monster Hunter Wilds, but the point is that it's framed as you're certainly gonna have some weapons break, and that causes the player to try different things. Now, this is a contentious point for my specific audience, but I would like to ask some of you who are feeling a little prickly about that to remain open-minded about the topic in general. For game design, especially in these extremely mainstream popular games, is not for us specifically, but for the entire population. You do not need to encourage me to use more variety. I would argue that encouraging me to use more variety, but forcing me at gunpoint to use more variety is bad, makes the game worse than it would otherwise have been. If I would use different things anyway, is there really a benefit to having me forcibly lose the option I liked so far when I would freely have switched to something else on my own? Now I'm still going to switch to something else, but you have taken away the thing I had before. I think there's a pretty strong argument that this is essentially just a lose-lose for people that already would have experimented. There's no real benefit to then taking away the thing that they had, as long as they really would have experimented on their own. And you could see this as kind of babying the player a little bit. That being said, I feel it has been sufficiently statistically demonstrated that most people will not use their damn consumables, right? People won't go through their stuff. And so you can see why these games have these systems. I might personally disagree and feel like they're being made for people who don't like fiddling with the game. And they're trying to adapt to that rather than leaning into being like satisfying for people who do like to fiddle. But then they created a way you can repair your durability, so I don't have to like it. But I don't think it's fair to say that that is a mad, illogical decision for them to make. They're trying to encourage the player to use the stuff in their inventory and not treat consumables as precious. And Breath of the Wild is interesting here because, like many Zelda games, there are items that do a thing in combat or solve a puzzle or whatever that are not consumable. You know, like you have a key item, usually. Whereas in something like Monster Hunter Wilds, there is almost nothing that is not at least temporarily consumed when you use it. Even your weapon. You know, it doesn't break, but it will get blunt, and then you have to sharpen it. You don't have a limited supply of sharpening. You can sharpen things as much as you need to, but you do need to stop and do that. And so, yeah, the game frames it as you're going to get comfortable using that item wheel. You arguably cannot play Monster Hunter Wilds, I would say Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom too, without going into your inventory. So whether you like how they've done it or not, they definitely do accomplish the goal of getting the player into that inventory. And I think that this is a good thing with the negative side effect for me that it means you're taking away my build tools that I liked, that I would happily have swapped off of anyway, by making them consumable. In a way, then, Monster Hunter Wild's advantage is that I don't feel like I have a limited amount of those things. They're technically limited, but not practically limited. So, two benefits, at least in my mind, of like meal heavy and consumable heavy experiences, which I think Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, and Monster Hunter Wilds are, compared to something like Remnant 2 that doesn't dig into these things as much. It just doesn't have very meaningful consumables, in my opinion. Those benefits are that it's kind of an additional mini build system / depending on how the game sets it up, you kind of don't need to do that at all except at a kind of pivotal moment, or it can be like a streamlined but additional build system like in Monster Hunter Wilds. And then two, that it benefits you if you are interested in variety. It strongly encourages gunpoint being held to you to explore a variety of stuff in the game. And I guess the thing I like about that is that it points to these games will then have to have interesting varieties of things to use, and they do, in my opinion. It is beneficial to do that. Things as simple as Monster Hunter Wilds lets you bring two weapons. You could swap to the other one instead of sharpening. Not a huge reason to do that, but you can do it. There's other reasons to swap weapons. And you might use different types of items, consumables, traps, buff items, meals, depending on just what you have. And in Breath of the Wild Tears of the Kingdom, you might assemble an item, a weapon, a quick build, a meal, and then not have more of that and use something else because it is in theory limited, even if you can get as much as you want back overall. It's not permanently limited. That is, these items lean into this idea that you can basically use this whenever it would be relevant to, but you can't literally spam it. It still matters that you have a limited amount. You can imagine how Monster Hunter Wilds, for example, would be different if you could put down as many traps as you had. Monster Hunter Wilds restricts it not only that you have to build the traps, so you could run out if you just put them everywhere. You would run out if you put them as everywhere as you would want to if the game gave you the freedom. You're carpeting maps with shock traps. This would make one or two fights utterly trivial, but then you would be out of shock traps. You can only bring one to the hunt, and it is one that you needed to build yourself, and therefore in theory, you could run out. If you don't pace yourself in any way, if you put your mind to it, you could run out, right? The game is gently pressuring you to not just use these literally 100% of the time, to consider using them and treat them as valuable, but hopefully calibrates its economy of resources in such a way that it's not like you can't get them if you need them. If you're being precious with them, you will have enough. That thing I think is cool. Like, that's interesting. That type of basic management and feeling like things are valuable in a game without feeling like they're overly scarce is pleasant. The way I'm going to describe this benefit is that the game puts you in a kind of stable orbit of resources, which can be very satisfying when you can embrace this sort of transience of human life. We're doing the Socrates thing again. What, for the purposes of this discussion, is a satisfying experience of human transience. You understand that these things are going to be consumed and you'll run out of them, and you can use them, and you hopefully get into an orbit where you do use them, but you know that you will get more in the long run. It's not like you've permanently lost that thing. So pretty good. I am answering some of your question very early then. I think that the design of having a lot of consumable and meal type consumable focus in Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, and Monster Hunter Wilds is very strong for those two reasons and others that we'll go on to say. I think that this is a great fit because it accomplishes its design goals. It's trying to get the player into their inventory, fiddling around using a variety of resources. And both games have a bit of a theme of a kind of David and Goliath. You're just some puny hunter that is using the resources they have to kind of deal with a much larger scale threat, and feeling like you have some ingenuity, you came prepared, you have a utility belt full of stuff is awesome. A really interesting type of kind of nega power fantasy, unempowerment but then re-empowerment fantasy, where you, the powerless fleshbag human, uses your ingenuity and tools to overpower your adversaries. That's just cool. I don't know. And you really feel, again, kind of like making a build, like you personally made the thing that made it possible to win. There's a unique feeling of like the basic things the game provided were not enough unmodified for you to win, and you made them into what allowed you to succeed. There's a kind of fulfillment in that, sure. Related, but not exactly the same fulfillment as making a build. I hope that parallel makes some sense. You kind of invent your playstyle, but then it's pretty much a tool. Making a normal build where you just set up options in your menu, and then you've got your equipment that does your certain thing for your build, and this build is better at, ambushing monsters right before they wake up or whatever. You did make that build and you kill the monster with that thing you made, but it's a lot closer to you programmed the last little bit of the video game using the game's own interface to create this playstyle. Whereas when it's consumables, you kind of feel like, well, I made that. with my own two hands, crafted it, forged it, and then, threw your destructible weapon at the monster and did a ton of damage. It's very satisfying when I think it's very satisfying in Breath of the Wild when you throw weapons at enemies and they shatter, but it does a ton of damage. I think that's fun. Um, so I think that there's a unique kind of similar but different appeal to making builds. And then again, that it often means that the game has a lot of interesting options to choose from, that you can really have a lot of fun looking through there are what items in Monster Hunter Wilds? If you play Monster Hunter and you haven't looked through the crafting menu thoroughly, I highly recommend you do so. What a fun, weird little part of the game. And there is nuance. I'm making it sound unnuanced. Like, yeah, technically they're limited, but you're not going to run out as long as you're reasonable about your resources. No, there's even layers. I mean, a fun one in Monster Hunter Wilds for me has been that the health and or defense, sorry, and damage potions that you can get. Those are basic versions, and then you can upgrade them. Now, the ingredient used to upgrade them is pretty limited. As far as I know, you only get it from hunting guardian monsters in Wyveria. You cannot auto gather it anyway. You have to go specifically kill a monster to get a use of that, just for the stronger version of these, damage and defense potions. But the basic versions, you can set it up in a way, having the villagers gather stuff for you, where you pretty much have an unlimited amount of these. You can use them for every hunt, kind of like an extension of your food buff, though it does cost you something. I mean, if you were to use them with total impunity, not even wait till they ran out, right? Again, you would run out if you did that much faster. You'd consume significantly more, and they do take up inventory space. In most of these games, you have some inventory space. One of the interesting things is we transition into like, what's going on with normal games and their items? That's kind of weird. One of the interesting things you can notice is that these games treat their meal systems and their consumables in general like build systems, very similarly, almost the same as build systems. You have a limited amount of space, you have opportunity cost. In Breath of the Wild Tears of the Kingdom, you can only have the one meal. At least I don't know these games well enough, having only dipped my toe into them, but I believe you can only have the one meal. You said unfortunately, but again, it creates that meaningful decision, that opportunity cost to the decision. While it might not be 100% necessary for it to be only one buff in every case, it depends on the game's system, of course. Again, it's that limitation in some form that is creating a kind of pressure instead of it just being that you run everything and that is the best, because of course it is. It's interesting to sacrifice a better defense potion because the resources are kind of scarce, and I don't know, money is tight in the Monster Hunter camp right now or whatever, and then you die and go, well, I was missing a little bit of defense, and you can have that, but if you use it every single time you would run out. There's an interesting tension there that you kind of chose that setup. Or the Breath of the Wild example, like your weapons, you can bring lots of stuff, but you still care about things being durable because they can break, they can run out. And so having a really durable shield or weapon is valuable, even though it's not necessary. That feeling like you chose to do it. All these things, much like build systems, are backhanded ways of kind of trying to get the player to just make their own decision instead of doing the right thing. They're trying to make it so there no meaningful correct course of action, and you're always losing something by picking one thing or the other, and therefore you have to make an actual decision, and therefore when you succeed or fail, you actually chose that approach. And so it feels like more of a success or failure. And more importantly, it is the story of your life where you were living as a human, as a meaningless speck of dust in this universe. There's no point other than doing it your way. And so these games encourage you to do that. And if you're already someone who would do that, at best, they reward you for doing that. They let you lean into doing that more, or let you experience the true failure of your idea being trash. I think that can be very satisfying as well. This build is just bad. That food buff was the wrong choice here. That's fine. I wanted the choice to feel meaningful. It's a two-way street. I do not mind if that choice feeling meaningful is that was the wrong choice, so that feels meaningful. That validates when I get it right, or do something that seems good in the future. Get it right in the many ways you maybe could, if I pick something that doesn't synergize well with this situation. So I think that's really beneficial. I think those games do it well, and it's good. What the heck is going on then with games like Remnant 2? I mean, we have a game where you have concoctions. You have these basic buff potions. Concoctions are you buy a thermos of soup from Mudtooth, or you get it as a drop in the world, and you drink them. Again, it's a meal. It's a consumable in the literal sense, a meal. And then for an hour, you get a buff. You can only have one at a time. And there are grenade items, and an important one in Remnant 2 is that there are some kind of longer term status effects, like a couple of minutes status effects you can get. Blights, I believe the game usually calls them. And you can cure these with consumables that are like a quick consumable. Like you put a bomb on, and in 1 second, the effect is gone. Cleansing items. And grenades, and poison grenades. Not a lot of variants. It's a game that's very light on items. Now, I think it's fair to say, as I kind of started the parlay with, that this is pretty normal. A lot of games are not as heavy on inventory stuff as Monster Hunter Wilds and Breath of the Wild Tears of the Kingdom. Some of our more inventory heavy games that are not straight up crafting, like building an environment type of experiences, right? This is not a real-time strategy game or an open world game where you build a settlement. This is largely like an exploration and combat type of game loop that Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, and Monster Hunter Wilds are in, and yet they have just like way more of a focus on items and consumable items than other games do. Remnant 2 doesn't, has the normal focus on that, which is not a lot. The normal focus is not very much. Why are they in there at all? I mean, if you don't have a lot of them and they're not very limited, then it doesn't really feel like the game is encouraging you to go through and use them a lot, because they don't, there is not a ton to gain from using them. They do specific things, or you have a very uninvolved system to use them with. Interestingly here, I think the fact that the concoctions are so simple makes it kind of less a part of the game. There's something kind of fun about getting your meal in Monster Hunter Wilds, and it's a constant meme in the community, but I mean, they really glitz up the gratuitous screenshot of your hunter eating the meat covered in cheese, the kunafa cheese. You get a little cutscene for the food. You can skip it, but I mean, a lot of people don't, and the reason is they put it there to entice you to use that system, and I think a lot of people have found that kind of fun. The simplicity of the concoction system is part of why you might not see it used as much. It just isn't fun in a kind of basic kinesthetic or visual way. And the concoctions are more limited. The benefits are more limited. You only get one little effect. It's interesting. A lot of people don't want to have to make a build, but actually also engage less if the system is too simple as well. It just doesn't seem interesting. I think for many people, the core issue to remember is you see people bouncing off of builds, but it's probably because they don't perceive the benefit, the fun of engaging with that system. They will probably say it's because they think it's like complicated or it takes too much effort. But I am going to assert that it is probably because they specifically do not see the value of that system. It's not about whether it is complicated or not. They don't know that because they haven't dug into the system. It's because they don't see the benefit of using that system, I think. Thus, you get the paradoxical situation where when a player is given a very, very, very simple build-like decision, you pick one concoction, you've got limited space to pick concoctions, you can take only one, you pick one. You find that people who seemed to just complain that the build system was too complicated are now not interested in a simple option. Huh? But if you think about it the way I was suggesting, that they don't see the fun or the benefit, well, then I think it makes sense again. It's just not clear what the pleasantness of this is. In Monster Hunter Wilds, having it be that your health is not complete until you eat the meal, well, the game makes it abundantly clear what the benefit of the meal system is, and then you get to make some very, very simple, very high-level, big chunk experiences, big cards for each ingredient. They do a really good job with that. It's not small things in your inventory, it's these big chunks, big blocky system choices. And you build out your meal and you eat it, and there's a cool cutscene, and you see your health bar go way up. that encourages the player to use that system again because they feel very clearly like they understand what the benefit of using that system was and the fun. They get to pick more attack or more defense, something simple like that. Build systems of all sorts are, at their best, fun in the same way, but it just might not be clear why they're fun like that. And I think these games do a good job of that. By contrast, why is Remnant 2 including these things? The grenades do rather weak damage. There's actually a lot of issues. Why is this stuff in here? Well, I have some answers. I don't think they're good parts of the game's design. I don't think this game achieves any design goals well with those items. I do think I can think of a lot of things they were trying to achieve by putting those items in, and it's not that they had no reason for putting them in, it's just that the justification is not a very strong justification for putting them in. That's going to be my thesis for this mini second part about I think Remnant 2 is not doing a good job with consumables. This is why. Or why are they in there anyway, but what is it failing at? If it's not doing a good job, what is it doing poorly? One of them is the pacing thing from Monster Hunter Wilds, Tears of the Kingdom, Breath of the Wild. You're going out to explore the open world. You're going to fight a boss. Basically, Monster Hunter doesn't contain any gameplay other than going out to fight a boss. It's like boss rush the game, and so having it be that there is some framing to that, you go into your tent, you eat, you restock your items, maybe do more, switch up your build or whatever. Maybe you died and so you're switching to a different build. Really frames the action, puts the player in the mindset that this is going to be hard. Or maybe it'll be easy, but let's say it's going to be hard. I ate a meal that was the defensive buffs on the meal, or the meal I think is the best. I use my expensive ingredients for the meal because I think it's going to be challenging. I switched my good build. I got my serious loadout. I put in my extra powerful defense potions, whatever. And then I go out, and that frames the action psychologically. If you die, you might be less frustrated. If you die, you have a gap in time as you're carted back to the camp, dumped with Vigor Wasp juice, and then sent back out there. You get a ride back. You get a kind of pacing thing instead of slamming your head against the fight over and over. Imagine, as an example, how different these games, Remnant 2 as well, would feel if when you died, you came back to life right away instead of getting in Monster Hunter Wilds carted back to the camp, dumped out, and then you have 3 lives at base. If you had those 3 lives and you just on the spot, you get hit, you don't even flinch, but then your health bar restores and that was one of your 3 lives. Imagine how different that would feel. When you were winning, you'd feel much more powerful and like those were very consumable, very usable for a strategic benefit deaths, lives. And when you were losing, you barely even get time to blink and see your mistake, think about you dying, change tactics and do something different before you're right back into it. Or you would change the game a lot if you did that. The same thing holds true in Remnant 2. Having it be that you have the option to buff up. You have the option to equip consumables. And when you die, you go back to your little campfire, though it is often literally right outside the boss room, so you will get to try again very fast, which is not all bad, but it does remove that benefit of the ride back. You get some time to decompress. You can see it has echoes of the same design ideas. And if you look at this in Souls-likes, if you want to call Remnant 2 that, and Monster Hunter Wilds isn't the least related game to a Souls-like in the first place. If you look at Souls-likes in general, Dark Souls and its ilk do this. They create some kind of pacing where the player is gently encouraged not to slam their face against the fight over and over again the exact same way. Like maybe you run out of a resource and then you go get more of it, or you have the option to eat a consumable and then you're a little better off. There's a morale benefit, I think. If you have a potion that, like in Remnant 2's concoctions, doesn't actually increase your performance very much, I think a lot of them are not very significant effects, but I mean you did buff up in some way, it can be a boost to make the player feel like, well, this time maybe I can do it. I just needed a little bit more. I'm immediately yawning at this part because I don't experience this at all. I believe in myself and I don't think it's hopeless. I know that I'm just going to learn due to muscle memory if I try long enough. And when I give up on these fights, it's because I don't find it interesting to just wait until I inevitably win. I'm not like proud of winning if I practice over and over again. If I do the fight 20 times, of course I'm going to win. The only thing that would impress me would be doing it without the time that makes you basically guaranteed to succeed. I'm just not proud of that achievement, and thus I also don't feel demotivated if I lose. I would win given the time. That's not what I'm interested in or worried about. I'm interested in whether it will be fun to go on that journey rather than whether I will get to the destination. I definitely will. My human muscle memory will be just fine, right? At least that's how I generally feel. But that's fine. It's not bad to be demotivated. That's perfectly natural. I don't know, self-centered about my ability to learn using my muscle memory or whatever. You wanting some additional encouragement in a fight you're struggling with, it makes sense, right? I'm arguing that is not the strongest use of consumables. It's not a very robust use of consumables, but you can see, like, they don't have no effect on the game's design, of course. The grenades, well, they're weak, but if they weren't weak, then you might feel like you needed a bunch of them, and you needed to throw a bunch of them to be effective. You can see the problem. If consumables are only a small part of your game, yeah, it creates that weird tension where if they're good, then the player feels pressured to use them or they're worse off, and pressured to grind for them if they run out. I definitely had this experience in Lies of P. The consumables, the throwables in Lies of P, are way too powerful. And by that I mean, well, they're effective, and they were probably put in intended as a kind of modular easy mode. When you're having trouble with a fight, you can use the resources you've saved up, consume them, have an easier time for that fight that you're specifically having trouble with, trivialize the element you're not enjoying, and then move on with the game. There are some problems though. First of all, because they're really strong, you know that if you were to grind instead of trying to have fun playing the game by your wits and the skin of your teeth, you would be better off. So the challenges do feel a bit fake once you notice that. And if you have trouble with a fight, a lot of trouble, and you keep dying, well, now you don't have the consumables. So the fight actually gets harder. Oh, as you keep going. This is really bad. I absolutely, in my experience with Lies of P, simply modded the game to have unlimited consumables and just didn't use them the first few attempts of fights. And then if I got stuck, I used them as if I had, ground them out and did the thing, but just didn't force myself to waste hours of my sadly limited existence grinding out these cannonballs to throw at the enemy. Now, you could argue, again, there's a mini version of that pacing thing there, don't you think? They want you to take a break from the fight and go get the resources for the throwables, and then you'll be better off the next time. You took a breath away from it, and you'll be okay. But if you're not losing by that much, I don't think that works very well. That just makes you feel like, well, I know I would win if I had those items now. That would be fine. I don't need to decompress. I want to try again and finish the fight, but I can't because I have a limited amount of this overpowered throwable item, so I need to go farm more of it. Not having a robust relationship with these items, I propose, is kind of the issue. Now, Monster Hunter Wilds, Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, well, they have more design that is hooked into your inventory and your consumables, so this isn't as much of an issue. You don't have to worry about things being powerful or not because the game just assumes you're going to use one and makes it part of the core combat. You always have a concoction active if we were to make the parallel to Remnant 2, and it just makes those resource economies interesting, involved because it's a big part of the game. It's harder to do that if the game has that on a local level. If it's not a huge focus of the game, you won't assume a lot of players will do it. And indeed, in Remnant 2, there's some weird problems as well. If you buy a concoction, I mean, that's a good amount of the value of upgrading one of your weapons a level permanently for a temporary buff that you might take. Aggressively buying concoctions early in the game might semi-permanently muck up a player's progression curve if they use them aggressively, which the game doesn't encourage them to, but because it's not a very robust part of the game, some players might just decide that is what would help them, and then it might backfire. It's not a very structured element of the game. My opinion about game design as a whole is that generally, if the game is not harnessing something psychologically to be part of the intended experience, the game is not directing the player to have this kind of experience with something, it's often a good idea to remove that thing, because it can save the player from themselves of kind of creating a worse, uncurated experience for themselves. Now, understand, I'm not trying to say that that means that anything open-ended that the player can use in any way they want is bad, obviously. When you put build options into a game, you're not directly curating the exact experience the player is going to have, but you are fulfilling this design idea that I have because you put in the build system stuff, you put in the options for players' builds, intending them to fiddle around with them, intending them to have a controlled, structured, kind of seeded sandbox for which to discover new build options. You don't take total control. You don't engineer the psychological experience they'll have from the ground up, but you still intend them to do the experimenting they're going to do. If you leave these consumables in games and the game doesn't have a robust economy for them, I mean, who knows what the player is going to convolute themselves into thinking they should be doing with them. And that can be bad. If they don't add much and the player runs the risk of kind of pitfalling themselves with the consumables, haha, pitfall trap in Monster Hunter Wilds, maybe it's better to just remove them if they don't fulfill a clear design goal, or to remove something and replace it with something that does the job better. For example, I could see a simple system in something like Remnant 2 or a lot of Souls-likes where you die to a boss and your blood, literally blood, is seeping out of the arena. And this forms a well outside of the arena at your campfire. And as you die, you gain ingredients for potions that you can use to buff yourself up. Now, you maybe every 2 or 3 attempts, you get a charge of potion. So you do maybe get put in the feeling like you need to farm to get your better buff that gives you a better chance against the boss, but you farm by attempting to defeat the boss. And I think it would feel quite good if you'd been struggling with a boss and the time you won was when you were making an attempt so that you could, fill the potion thing. And you're going to have to make it be that you fill the potion well more if you get further on the boss, so that the player is encouraged to actually try. We're not getting into it here. I'm not saying that with no further work is a good idea to add to a Souls-like. I'm just giving you a taste of, as a game designer, this is a thing you could do to make it a structured, kind of intended psychological experience designed to motivate the player. The reason it's in the game is not because consumables. That's not a reason. It's not because Dark Souls has them and people like Dark Souls. That is not a complete reason. Why do people like them in Dark Souls? Do people like them in Dark Souls? Is that part of what made Dark Souls good? Could it be that Dark Souls is a game people like, but this is actually something that they don't like about it? I have no idea. This is just an example. I think people really don't interrogate this enough. They have a tendency to say, well, it's a video game, it's consumables, the player's having trouble, they consume them. That's not enough for it to be a good piece of design. You need a more robust answer. You don't need to make the game consumables.exe, which is what Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom and Monster Hunter Wilds development names were. Incidentally, the title of my upcoming autobiography, consumables.exe, he died as he lived. But you don't need to do that, but you do need to have there be some structured, clocked, tracked benefit that it gives to the player, rather than just putting it in and saying, oh, if they're having a tough time, they can drink them and that'll be fine. It's like fine, but much less good of a design idea than it could be for not much more work. If you just thought about, how will this make the player behave and feel? Do some very basic psychology about what effect it will have on the player. This has been a refrain in my videos for the past few months. Games are massively underusing this kind of incredibly basic imagining the experience of the player psychology in their game design. Many games, good and bad, well-pronounced games with a lot of thought put into them, have for some reason not put almost any thought into this particular way of thinking about game design, which is insane to me. It is so much easier to make good parts of games if you just think about why things are in the game. It's kind of wild to me that we're even having a conversation about this. I will say that I think an interesting thing about Remnant 2 is that it has this design element that I've seen in a lot of other games where you can have more than one concoction. You can have two with the Alchemist, I believe, class prime perk. So you multi-class in Remnant 2, and one of them is your primary class. There's no difference between them except that you get their exclusive perk for being their primary class. So if you have Alchemist be your primary, then that means that you can have two concoctions active at once. There's also a legendary perk when you finish leveling up your Prism, a big passive item in Remnant 2 that gives you passive stats mostly. There's a legendary perk at the very end. You get a random kind of build defining perk at random, boo, but it's cool build options, yay, maybe, if you get lucky. One of them out of a list of like 50, you understand. You're not going to get this. You can't go get this, but in theory, it's possible, if they made a better system, to get this perk that exists in the system that lets you have, I believe, 4 more concoctions active. So if you do that and Alchemist, you could have 6 active. That is pretty similar to just straight up moving down a difficulty bump. You could buy 6 concoctions and then kind of jump the game's difficulty down a notch if you wanted to. I actually think that's kind of interesting. Now, again, note, you can't do that at all. Like, if you play Remnant 2, it is very likely you will play for 1,000 hours before you ever get that perk. You cannot control getting that perk. So that's not, like, really actually a part of the game, unfortunately. Even if you wanted it to be, though you could probably figure out hacking that into the game pretty easily. Not suggesting or not that you do that. I'm just noting, like, objectively, it's not very hard to make the game give you that, just not using the game unmodified. Do with that information what you will. And then it would be expensive, right? To buff up your 6 concoctions, you need to buy 6 concoctions. For an enfranchised endgame player, one concoction, what are they, like 500 scrap or whatever the resource is called? But I mean 6 getting up to it being 3,000 scrap. For every single serious attempt of a fight that you were having trouble with, does add up. Like, that would be a more robust experience for the player where they have to really decide about that resource a little bit. And yet you can get a lot of scrap if you put your mind to it. You can see how in a game where that was like at all possible to get, a more robust part of the game's experience, that wasn't the only build literally in the whole game that cost any money or consumable resources to use, and the difficulty was more balanced around you maybe like jumping up in power somehow. It could be a really interesting part of the game, but I think as it stands, again, it's not like there are no reasons for consumables to be in the game. They kind of give you an out if you're having difficulty. You can sort of briefly activate an easy mode against fights you're having more trouble with. Kind of, not really, but sort of. And then you move on. Kind of. But I don't think it's a very robust or complete system. I do think that it is that they copied it from other popular games, and then they like had a reason for putting it in, but just not a very good reason for putting it in. We didn't get into it here because I don't know much to say, but indeed, as CMeister pointed out, there are some consumables in Remnant 2 that are much more baffling as to what their benefit would be. Consuming this takes a few seconds, and the buff lasts for like literally 20 seconds. Even the menuing required could be a little, There are these items in Monster Hunter Wilds that are like big damage and armor boosting pills, but they last, I believe this version lasts literally 30 seconds. And so it's like, okay, you need to be really weaving it into your combat. You could play Sword and Shield, where you can eat it without putting away your Sword and Shield. But that's one weapon out of the like 14 or whatever options in the game. And I mean, you really better be timing that. You know, what are you doing for those 30 seconds? Understand, I'm sure there is someone on the internet who has a very interesting answer to like how you can use those pills to get some benefit in Monster Hunter Wilds. But my point is that that's an interesting texture to the game because you probably already are using buff consumables. Monsters, if you're attacking them and doing a lot of damage very effectively, might run away to a new area within a few minutes, meaning there'll be a gap in combat every few minutes. 30 seconds sounds a little more feasible, and wouldn't you know it, there are some intermediate consumables that don't last like a half hour, like those buff potions I mentioned earlier, and don't last 30 seconds like these pills, but last more like 3 minutes, I believe it is. Okay, I mean, that actually is an interval of time, the game rewards. You're going to go through a lot more of those, their powders, than you would of other consumables. But I mean, you could fit that in, and now the player is making a decision in an economy of resources about how much to use. Even my Mushroom Mancer example, where, yeah, there are some builds that kind of consume more resources in Monster Hunter 2, like in the Alchemist example in Remnant 2. You might have a build that is eating mushrooms for additional effects, and you can try to auto gather them, but you are using more resources than other builds would, sure. But there are some weapons that lose sharpness faster, and some strategies where you'd want to swap between weapons, and the ranged weapons have limited ammo, and there are other builds in Monster Hunter Wilds. The game has a robust collection of strategies where you need to do some additional work to make the strategy work. That is a part of the game, as a robust aspect of the game's design. It's not something that you could if you put your mind to it, I guess, but it's not something you would as easily fully avoid. Whereas in Remnant 2, it's like items could just completely not exist and provide almost no benefit most of the time. But if you want to take way more trouble and lose way more resources, you can gain a modest benefit. There are some interesting uses of consumables. Those do not detract from this discussion, just because it is possible to do something interesting with consumables in Remnant 2. My point is just that the game has a less fleshed out system for them. They are more of a throw in instead, rather than something that it clearly makes sense or is related to the game's design. They are what I would describe as an incomplete design idea. They don't, there's not no reason for them. There's not no need being filled by them, but they don't fill it very well. They're kind of just an idea from video games that was grabbed and put here to like maybe sort of do the thing. And a more robust or purpose crafted solution would be better, I think. The cherry on the top is that in any game where you don't specifically go out of your way to encourage the player to use consumables, they usually avoid them like the plague. Again, a big benefit of Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, Monster Hunter Wilds, consumables.exe over here is that meals are a pretty good gateway into using other consumables, which the game has a ton of and kind of forces you to use for basic combat mechanics, and this gets the player digging through their inventory and using all the stuff. Certainly, in a game where you have made a lot of the content be consumables the player can use, it is a good idea to do something to get them using them, sure. Like if you are trying to make that fun, you certainly do want them to like be using them, you know. But I don't know. I do not approve of Remnant 2 consumables. We could have a very interesting discussion, I'm sure, about how Remnant 2 is kind of like this with design in general. There are lots of things in the game that are sort of like word cloud of things people like, but why specifically this way in specifically this game? I don't know, you know? And that doesn't mean all of it's bad. Remnant 2 got a build system of the year slot for me last year, and that's because I think that it does some of its elements very, very well. But it does them well by doing a system that it grabbed from another game very well, and by just so happening to pick a system from other games that is a good fit for Remnant 2's design. There are also systems it's grabbed from other games that are not especially a good fit for its design, but they just kind of put them in anyway. At least that's how I feel. Or there's a lot of tension created by putting that system in. So it's a troubled way to do some game design, but it's what they did. And I think there were some good results. Those systems they grabbed from other games are good in those games, right? And it's too bad. I feel like some of their own more original parts of the game's build systems are the best parts. They did a good job. It doesn't mean that they're idiots or couldn't have done a better job on their own. No, rather I'm suggesting that they should have done a better job on their own, and instead kind of shied away and took a pre-existing thing instead. What a shame. They probably would have done such a brilliant job if they had not done that. Wah. And it's maybe Monster Hunter and the Zelda series like relative weirdness that means that those games, yeah, we're gonna get their own esoteric little solution, and so it fits the purpose pretty well because this isn't really a thing in a lot of other games. So good stuff. What a fun question. I went way too long on it because I had a ton to say. Thank you for asking this. If you want to submit questions like this, you can do that using a link I'm posting in chat right now. I can't believe I added that to the end of a parlay. We'll cut around here. So I thought that they were really good design decisions in those two games, but not so much in Remnant 2. Thank you for asking this parlay. Folks, if you want to get parlay like this, you can do that using a link in the description. We'd love to have you. It can be something like this. It can be longer, shorter, something more or less focused about games or not. Whatever you like. We'd love to have you. Looking forward to the next one.